Dear class, welcome to International Relations Lectures. This is Sophia Barkett, and we are talking about statecraft. Hope you're having a good weekend. What is statecraft? Essentially, statecraft is about the methods that states use to achieve particular goals, such as how they persuade one another, how they reward one another, and punish one another. So we're talking about disciplining and punishing, right? How do states discipline and punish, basically? How do they persuade? And this leads us to the question of power, right? Because how can you have disciplining and punishing if you don't have a power differential between states, right? And of course, we're using power, but we're also seeing there must be some power differential. Not every state can go around punishing and disciplining other states. There has to be some power differential. So maybe we're talking about superpowers, maybe we're talking about regional powers, but there has to be some kind of power differential here. Let's look at how superpowers deal with weaker states. So this week you're going to look at the Melian Dialogue. It is part of the history of the Peloponnesian War written by Thucydides. And it's a really good example if you're interested to see how states talk to each other. Believe it or not, when states actually deal with each other, this is pretty much the language they use. And we'll see some of that this week in the folder, right? That's been set up. You'll see some videos and things. And when you look at the Melian Dialogue, you can really see the way that states are behaving with respect to each other. What kind of tactics are they using? Do we see a real show of power by the Athenians? Is the olive branch that the Athenians offer to the Melians, is it a false one? What kind of diplomacy is being used? And look at the attempt by the Melians to use negotiation. So this is a really good example for understanding how states might behave with one another. Where do states exercise power? Is it just in those one-to-one negotiations where they have? Is it right before they declare war? Is it through the economic and military aid that they offer each other? What are these avenues through which power can be exercised? Let's check out non-state actors. So these non-state actors, in this statecraft video, it's as though we're talking just about states, but is it possible that non-state actors might be swept into this whole, statecraft business? Some of the non-state actors are international organizations, the international governing institutions, rather, non-governmental organizations, corporations, and social movements. Here we're asking the question, do these non-state actors have their own agendas, or do they become instruments of states or pawns of states, right? Of course, we can't imagine corporations becoming simply pawns of states. They literally have to make money. Their whole agenda is based on money. So how might their goals become congruent with state goals and vice versa? How might state goals be about protecting corporations, right? Let's look at international governing institutions. We know that the birth of these kinds of institutions happens in the early 20th century. You have Woodrow Wilson trying to create the League of Nations. He's essentially challenging the European powers after World War I to sit down and actually sort out their problems, just like they used to do in the Concert of Europe, right? But now he's saying more than that. He's saying that what about the other states on this planet? They have the right to self-determination. What does this mean? It means that European colonies have to end. European colonialism throughout Africa, Asia, and other places must end. That's what he's saying, right? We need to have independent nations that can sit together at the League of Nations and negotiate, like sensible people, right? And ultimately, his plan doesn't follow through in a good direction. US does not join, and we see that the nations that do join end up basically um, engaging in all kinds of power politics and punishing Germany, and that leads to a whole nother problem, right? With World War II. So liberalism is this beautiful idea of self-determination of states, of liberty, and all this good stuff, right? But the whole agenda strikes many people in Europe as a problem. E.H. Carr, who is a British realist who worked for the Foreign Office in the UK, calls out Wilson and says, this is nothing more than raw aggression from America, the desire to displace European powers, right, and become a new superpower. So he says, watch out for America, it's gunning for us, right? And so with liberalism, we see literally this big question mark. Is it really all this feel good kind of a thing, or is it something else? Is it disguised US imperialism? Later in 1944, we see that, World War II has begun and it's basically destroying Europe, but also Asia, Africa, all over we're seeing the war happening, and not so much in America itself, but America gets involved and plays a major part after the first atomic bomb is established, is dropped on Japan. You see that the US becomes a major superpower, and soon after, that USSR also becomes a superpower. Now, FDR is in a position to tell Churchill and the French and other European colonies to leave Vietnam and other colonies, to basically get out of this game of colonialism, right? He's saying it's your time is over, it's now our time. So he's making this known in a very direct fashion, face to face, sitting with Churchill, okay? And then FDR actually meets Stalin and also Chiang Kai-shek because, he declares China as one of those countries with the most population in the world. These are countries that have to be taken seriously when it comes to foreign policy. And so he's sort of saying that, I've talked to the head honchos, these are the world leaders, and we're all saying that European colonialism needs to end. So you see that there's this greater purpose of freedom and liberty being established by the end of World War II and through the US move. So US is emerging as a superpower hell-bent on creating a free world. At the same time, the critics from Europe are saying, well, this is about US imperialism. So what goals can international organizations then have? There is the raw power of the US and the USSR and China. And now you have more powers, as you saw in the last written assignment. You have India emerging as an international, this superpower. There are other countries like Japan. You now have Russia to deal with, but Europe also has some, military powers. So is the United Nations Security Council then just going to play the role of balance of power? Is this why we have the United Nations again? Are there other kinds of goals for the international institutions? Some might say that the attempt has been to create a neoliberal order. Keohane and Nye, remember last time we talked about Keohane and Nye, and they kind of talk a little bit about the international governing institutions, right? And their suggestion is that some kind of complex interdependence has been created. Why might there be institutions? So Nicholas Onuf is a constructivist, and many of these constructivist IR theorists focus on what the institutions are and what do they do. So they will say that institutions by themselves create norms, rules, and their idea is to bother states until they conform. So if you're a member of the United Nations, there are many things United Nations organizations want you to conform to. And if you're not doing it, then you might get some kind of punishment, or if you're doing it properly, you might get some rewards. What other goals? So if we're trying to create a neoliberal order, what would that look like? Certainly, there would be a preference for free trade. So a neoliberal order is trying to essentially establish free trade around the planet. And that has to do with a lot of history, some of which we'll cover at some point. But the main goal is have free trade, have free flow of capital, essentially, right? So there's a capitalist agenda here. Capitalism cannot work unless capital can become invested in projects that are making money. So therefore, you need to drop all the barriers to the flow of capital. What about the free flow of labor? So that's a big question. We'll see how much labor can actually travel through borders. Maybe this is something we'll take up in a next lecture or another lecture rather. What about the protection of intellectual rights? So if you're producing software in the US, such as Microsoft and Google and other big corporations, you definitely want protection of intellectual rights. So all of this has to do with your company's ability to get royalties, right? So if you cannot have patents and trademark protection, right? And if those things are not enforced globally, then your corporation cannot make money. So these things become important in the agenda of the neoliberal order. What other global issues might be important? Internationally, we look around and we're every day talking about global warming, right? We're always thinking about non-renewable energy sources. Do we have enough of those, such as, coal and other kinds of resources, but also plant life, right? But also soil. Soil is living, but we cannot have sort of this unending soil as a resource if we are not protecting those resources, right? Food production. If we're going to have global food production shortages, what are we going to do about it? So all of these issues we can negotiate at some kind of international institutions, right? Usually at the United Nations. Maybe we might even bring these things up at the World Trade Organization. When we're talking about trade, we can say, look, we're having global shortages of food. We've decided not to send food to other countries. We're not going to export food, okay? So then this whole debate might arise about whether you should have free trade at all times or whether it makes sense, at any point to have protectionism. We also have seen with COVID, infectious disease management is a huge issue, right? It's a major thing, and you need collaboration, you need people to sit down and talk, and so you do need international institutions. There's also the issue of people. And again, I mentioned earlier that maybe this is not the topic we'll go into today. So let's actually stop talking here. And in the next lecture, we will elaborate on more international cooperation and conflict issues. So I wish you a great weekend.